big, deep concepts here. Pull out the notepad, take some notes, settle in.
If you're driving, don't do that. So go ahead, hit that pause button. Hopefully they unpause it at some point. Otherwise, we'll be waiting here a while. So
you never gave them instructions to unpause it, so we're just sitting here in status.
I have faith in our listeners that they'd be able to figure that out. So
I have faith in our good listeners and that they will actually listen to your instructions. So I don't know.
Yeah, you know, GDFC, not the average player.
Gosh, cut that.
Nope. Just keep it.
That might be the intro.
Alright, welcome everybody to GDFC podcast number 3. We're once again joined by Dustin Quibido.
Hey guys, how's it going?
And Brian Bmoy.
The immortal words of Keanu Reeves, I know Kung Fu.
Mr. Reeves, no you don't.
I don't know Kung Fu.
But you could one day.
Could one day.
Maintain that growth mindset.
That's right.
That's what it's all about here.
Help us settle disputes on the tabletop.
Yeah.
I know, we do not encourage that.
Let's step outside.
It's happened. There was that one guy that got kicked out of a Buffalo Wild Wings for starting fights.
Oh, goodness.
40K.
So, for those of you that don't know, Mr. Quibido here is a hardcore orc player.
Brian
Bmoy has,
never guessed it.
and Brian Bmoy has turned into somewhat of a connoisseur of many different armies. I do want to pose a question to both of you, and that is, if you could own any army that you do not currently own, which faction would you wish to add to your collection?
I'm guessing you're the one who's going to be writing the check to buy the models, of course.
Yeah, you know, all those views and likes is what's going to fuel this. So, in our dreams.
In that case, for me, I think it's going to be Drakari. I think they're a really awesome, fun faction. For those of you who are listeners for Skari, he really puts a dynamic energy into it. And every game I've had with a Drakari player has been a blast. Their models are super cool. And yeah, they have that nice mix of like hard hitting and the assault, but they got some shooting too. I like it. They're pretty cool, but it's very, very different from what I collect. So it would be tough to make the jump.
What about Brian? Are you going to do 2 selections again this week?
One. I think I can settle down to one. I'm going to go with Genghis Khan's Mongolian Horde. Are we talking about 40k armies? No. Exodites.
So I feel like we'd have a whole podcast on talking about Genghis Khan here and why you picked that. I think that says a lot about you.
I think we'll go. Maybe Dustin could touch on that in the psychology of 40k.
I could finally leverage my Chinese history degree.
Oh, okay. Here we go. But Exodites, Elder Exodites. There's something about pointy-eared space elves riding dinosaurs.
It would be another Eldar faction.
You know, I'm starting to stray away with Grey Knights and Custodes, but you know, in my heart of hearts, just something about dino riding space elves that if I had my dream army, or Exodites. That's it. Final answer.
Yeah, 2,000 points of Slith. Sign me up for that.
Something about that army just crosses too many wires in my brain, and it just fries dinosaurs and elves.
Get hit by the haywire cannon.
So for me, I think I've always wanted to do a Scion army. I don't think I will ever do it, but having a whole bunch of badass Tempestus Scions would be really sweet.
Yeah, those are fun to see. They got really, really cool rules. Yeah, I could see the appeal.
All right, so we can't have a GDFC podcast without talking about the 9th edition news of the week. This week was a little light in information, except there were a couple hidden gems and big bombs that were sort of dropped. We saw changes to the way character protection works with the new Lookout Sir rule, where characters now also have to be within 3 inches of vehicles, monsters, or units of 3 or more. We saw big changes to Overwatch, going into a stratagem, limiting the amount of fire that you're going to take while in the charge phase. And another hidden gem in the way fighting on your opponent's turn works when you're locked in combat. Where when it comes to non-charging fights, it's the players whose turn it is not that actually gets the first nomination to fight. So, the first news of the day, let's talk about Lookout Sir. How do you guys think this is going to affect the game?
This is what you were talking about, incentives for taking larger unit sizes. I'm thinking about those minimum squad units, right? Or been doing a lot of custodies work. So if we've got 3 model deep squads, that's going to make it difficult to protect your characters. So vehicles become more important. Ability to screen out and positioning of these characters become infinitely more important as well. I like this change though.
I do like the change a lot as well. One concern I do have that has already been identified with the wording of it, some rules as written issues that hopefully will be addressed, on a day 1 or even a day 0 change. Because I would hate to see triple chappy treads hanging out in a triangle with each other, negating this rule, because it's a fantastic new rule. It remains to be seen. I think it's going to have big changes for how people move their forces up. Having that lone wolf character hold an objective safely is less of a thing. That was actually one of my plans moving into 9th was use Makari for that purpose. And now that I think that idea is kind of off the table. So some factions will definitely need to change how they approach holding objectives.
I mean, Brian, I love holding field objectives with my single Death Jesters, and now I'm going to have to reset Death Jester with some sort of squad to keep him...
Yeah, it could be an issue for elite armies, especially that don't have that kind of extra points to do it. I know Custodes players were very concerned about the change, especially Harlequins, obviously, would be another one. So we'll see.
Yeah, I think it'll be very punishing for people that don't plan out their turn very effectively, particularly when it comes down to the charge phase. Because if you're not careful about where you're putting your character, you're going to lose them. And if you're not careful, if you weren't planning ahead on how you're charging, you're going to very quickly find your characters isolated and very subsequently eliminated.
Did we talk about the changes to the declaration of charges yet, Brian? Because I think this is probably my favorite rules leak review from this week.
Oh, no, we did not. So they did announce that now when you declare a charge, you have to successfully charge everyone you declared or the charge fails. So gone are the days of hiding in a ruin just saying, I'm declaring everything within 12 inches because I can.
They're so strategic with how they're doing these because, the one we just discussed with characters, it's very tit for tat, right? So elite armies are sensitive to that change. But for this one, for Horde, it's the opposite side, right? Where I love to declare on absolutely everything that is within 12 inches. That way, hey, if I get boxcars, I'm coming in, baby. Can't do that no more. So it's very, give a little bit to one side, give a little bit to the other side. That way, they're kind of balancing the salt that might be coming from these changes.
And I love how tactical this becomes in a game of 40K now. You have a unit that's 6-7 inches away, but right behind that, maybe 9 inches away, are some characters. Do you want to try to declare that character your charge, knowing that you're not likely to make it, 20% chance to make it? On the flip side, that character might be able to heroically intervene and really do some damage in return. So I see this just, a game of trades, almost thinking about it like chess. Like, how do you position, cover your pieces, and keep them protected?
But again, the tit for tat. So people were saying heroic intervention. That's going to be a big thing with these declaration of charge rule changes. But the one we just found out, kind of hidden inside the Death Guard article today, is that the defender, after all the charge attacks are complete, the defender is the one that gets to choose the first fight. So let's say that you heroically intervened on the preceding fight phase. Come next turn, that is in fact your turn. Your heroically intervening character could very well be getting slammed because they're no longer your first choice in the fight order. So it makes you think, do I want to act? It's more decisions, right?
Yeah,
I love it.
Forcing more skill in having to evaluate, that risk versus reward.
I think though, if you're a player who favors the fight phase, this was a good week for you. The changes to Overwatch are enormous. The changes for the order of how fights happen, in terms of if you charge, you're going to fight first, and then the subsequent next player's turn, you're going to fight again at the top after all the charges are done. That's very, very, very favorable if you are an army that likes to charge. Very powerful.
I do think it was a very masterful change because, we didn't talk too much about the change to Overwatch, but with basically reducing how much Overwatch you can take, they shifted the risk and, the risk factor of declaring your charges from that.
Yeah, I could have saw a mass riot about the Overwatch changes if they hadn't made that change for the charge declaration. Because, if I'm a Khorne Berserker, I got 10 of these guys and I'm coming in, I'm going to declare on everything, because what are you going to do? You can only overwatch me once because of how you spin the stratagem. And if I'm a Tau player, I'm not happy with that. But again, they're seeding just enough to where no matter what side of the game you play on, you're not going to be too upset.
Right. It is a very clever shift in power from reducing the overall power in Overwatch to shifting the risk in charging to your decision. And what am I actually going to charge? And there's a lot of counterplay, and you talked about, Brian, and how you position to make those charges risky for people. So forming up ranks at different distances, hiding characters behind units to heroically intervene. It makes the charge phase much more interesting.
It does, and don't tell my fellow work players, but I was actually a Tau player for quite some time in 8th edition as well. I actually owned a lot of almost as much Tau as I did Orcs during 8th edition. But they always had the decision of, when do I pop the greater good? Because you can't continue to do it every single charge. And this is going to have everyone making those same choices of, when do I choose to make my Overwatch the best I can?
What's interesting about all this news about Overwatch, about changes with shooting, about changes with charging, look out, sir. What I'm hearing is movement is going to be such a focal point of 9th edition 40K. And I love it. I'm here for all of it.
Yeah, I mean, it was very clearly the thing that would win you games before, but oddly, something not as many people focus on as much as they should be. And I think you're going to have to in 9th edition to adapt to the changes.
Because it's this week, I will go ahead and say 100% absolutely.
I don't know if we had a weak stipulation on the wager there, so maybe we'll see some fortifications in our next game.
I'll have to figure out TTS first, eh?
Yeah. I'm very excited to see the rules writers continue to introduce very interesting and compelling choices into the gameplay. At the same time, speeding it up and sort of fixing kind of janky or parts of the game that didn't work so well. The main subject of the podcast today is what makes a complete 40K player. To answer this question, I assigned a little bit of homework a couple weeks ago to some of the members of GDFC, where I had them make concept maps. Now, to make a concept map, you're essentially writing down all the different elements that come to your mind when you think of a 40K player. And the second step to that is really linking all those things together, finding out how they're related to one another. Then we sat down, we compared our notes, and we were able to sort of boil everything down to 5 different categories. So for this show, we're going to break things up into 2 parts. The first part of the show, we're going to look at the 5 areas we all sort of had in common, and that's pre-game knowledge, in-game decision making, player health, sportsmanship, and hobby. In the second half of the show, we're going to show how this can be useful, because we're going to tackle some complex ideas such as in-game strategy as well as list writing, and how these complex topics are really pulling from all these different facets that you have to develop as a 40K player. So if we start with some pre-game knowledge, the core rules, which if anyone knows, there's a ton in 40K. Where do you guys like to start? If you had a new player and you had them the stack of rule books that they need nowadays to play the game and FAQs, where do you start them?
I like to send them straight to the 2nd edition rulebook and then have them go through the history of 40K.
You got to earn your dues.
It's like the Horus Heresy. You can't start reading on book 24. You got to start from number 1, right?
That's exactly right.
Now, to answer your question, I think you got to go through the phases one by one. That's the best approach for me. I think that's the way the books start with it too, because each phase kind of builds on the next, and it helps you visualize what the flow of the game is. Helps the player who is completely new to this grasp it at a better level.
What do you say to a new player, though, that is unsure of, there's just too much rules to know, I can't know it all. I'm afraid to even just play a game because I'm going to mess something up.
Everyone messes up games, I'm sure Sean Naden at the top of the tables at LVO was probably Mr. Ruler too. It's just how it's played, and one has to understand that, this is acceptable casualties, right? That you're going to miss a couple of your rules that help you in the nature of sportsmanship. You understand that you'll probably miss some rules that benefit you also. And that's just the nature of it. Like, don't be intimidated by the complexity of the rules. You have to start somewhere. and mistakes it's literally part of the game. If everyone played a perfect game of 40K, this would just be like playing Yahtzee versus my mother-in-law. And you know what? That might not be so bad because I beat her every time anyways.
It's dice rolling skills, practicing them sixes.
When I played with new players and they ask great questions, they ask, wait, are you sure this is how this works? Can you help explain that to me? And I'll often find, whether it's in the core rulebook or my own rules, I'm like, oh, wow, actually, it's a little more nuanced than I had even thought, or they're good refreshers for how rules work. And so one thing that I would say to your point, Brian, about being intimidated is everyone, I don't care if you've been playing since 2nd edition or if you started just this edition, everyone is going to make mistakes, and a little grace goes a long way in helping everybody have a good gaming experience.
Yeah, I think that's part of the trick is you never want to fool yourself into thinking, yes, I know all the rules. Because the fact is you don't. And while, Brian, you did touch on the idea that, yeah, we want to extend some leniency to your opponent because mistakes will happen. I think you can only do that if you're also making an honest effort to police yourself and look for your own rules mistakes. Because if you're not finding your own rules mistakes, you are not looking hard enough. And we touched.
That is a wonderful point.
And we did touch on this in the last Coach's Corner, the sort of trust and verify method where, yes, the better you know a rule, doesn't necessarily mean you have to look it up right then and there, but I think you should constantly go back and look at, constantly learn those rules because you're going to get them wrong, or as you know, you highlighted, sometimes you will miss some of that nuance that's sort of hidden in there. So we have a lot of the core rules, faction rules in the game, but it's not some multiple choice test that we're taking to beat your opponent. It's applying them to the tabletop. In-game decision making is a very critical part of the game. And Brian, in our discussions, you had a very good sort of analogy in breaking this down.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Brian. I like to look at 40K as an elaborate game of chess, except you get to choose the pieces on your side of the board. And I think one of the critical skills of a 40K player is the ability to evaluate a unit's effectiveness or capabilities on the tabletop, whether that's yours or your opponent's. The way that I like to look at it is, okay, if I'm playing a horde army, maybe they have more pawns that I need to be aware of. Or if I'm playing against a shooting-centric army, maybe they have more rooks and bishops that are looking for firing lanes. This combat army might have more knights. And how do I quickly look at a list, assess the different roles and capabilities that these units have? How am I going to develop my own pieces to take position of the board, create threats, and essentially progress my game towards my own win conditions as effectively as possible?
And another very important thing that had come up in a lot of our analysis of each other's sort of maps and how we had broken down this information was that physical health and psychological health of the player has a big impact on the ability to make these sort of in-game decisions.
Yeah, definitely. I think if people have never actually attended a 40K tournament, I think they're in for a surprise. A lot of us are accustomed to playing a casual game over the course of a couple of hours with friends, or maybe something a little bit more faster paced at your game store. But going the distance, it's a serious thing. If you're playing a 3-round or even a 4-round tournament of 40K in the course of one day, physical endurance is actually a thing. We alluded earlier to hydration and make sure you're eating right and getting a good night of sleep. But as both a player and a TO, one of the most fascinating aspects of a tournament is watching that last round of the tournament and just people falling apart. The judgment of people, the decision-making people will just drastically plummet as the day goes down. And your first match, you could be hot stuff, but by the end of that, maybe not so much.
Yeah, the decision always seems so obvious after the game and you look back.
Exactly. And it's also like making sure you don't get too salty, you don't tilt between matches. I've seen people where they started hot, 1-2, lost 1, and then the last game of the tournament, they just completely fall apart. It's a thing that we don't do a lot on a weekly basis or a monthly basis when we're playing our regular games, but having the endurance to go through a tournament in a competitive setting, it really is a muscle that people need to flex and grow if they want to play at that high level. When you're in a competitive environment versus a person you probably don't know, there is an aspect of your personal psychology as you approach that match and the opposing psychology of the person you're playing. A lot of people think of 40K and other Games Workshop games as dice games. I don't see it that way at all. My personal perspective of it is that 40K is a social game where the psychology of yourself in terms of maintaining personal confidence and exuding that external confidence is just as much of a part of the game, while at the same time reading your opponent, right? Presuming what their judgments are going to be through their temperament, their body language, trying to figure out whether they're bluffing, and also, of course, maintaining the sportsmanship between both you and your opponent are things that you need to consider if you want to, climb in terms of your rankings and tournaments.
Another very important aspect of the game is the sportsmanship involved, because again, we enter a social contract with your opponent. You are playing another person and are both basically working through the game together. So what are some critical aspects to sportsmanship and playing with another human being?
We all understand that you're going to be there for a very long time with the other player. You're standing there for 2.5 hours to 3 hours with another human being, and ideally you're going to make the best of it and have a good time together. As Brian said before, it's a social contract. Come there ready to have fun. No matter how hardcore you're approaching the game from a rules perspective or a list perspective, come to have fun, and gauge your opponent as you're meeting them there too, that they're also there for that same level of sportsmanship. No matter how they act, though, again, this is one thing I think that we here really try to preach, is that be a role model, be a leader. People will increase the level of sportsmanship if you're also kind to them in return. One thing I do a lot when I'm at tournaments is, you got to stay hydrated. So I'm constantly getting water for myself, but I'm always offering to get, a glass of water for my opponent too. Sharing that camaraderie, have a moment with the other person, and have a good time. It'll both be a better match if you do.
I couldn't agree more, Dustin. I think about not even sportsmanship just within the realm of 40K, but sportsmanship from like an athletic standpoint as well, right? Good sportsman builds character. You teach respect, you teach discipline, you're teaching kindness, inclusion, which is exactly what you just mentioned there. And oftentimes these are things that I'm even teaching my kids, right? Sometimes it's not important how you win, but it's the journey of playing a game, or it's a journey of playing the game, right? And that's something that's so critically important, that a lesson that we're learning in life, that integrity of your character is so critically important, especially in 40K, where these communities tend to be relatively small, your regional community, and the ability to build these relationships, the ability to be recognized as somebody that is a good gaming partner. I tend to like that term more than the term opponent, because at the end of the day, we're, like you said, entering into the social contract. We're playing a social game together, and I want to make sure that whether we win or lose, that I'm having a good time and my opponent's having a good time, or my gaming partner's having a good time. It's just mindset shifts here and there that I think go a long way.
So now, the very last of the topic, a little divided sometimes in the community, and that's the hobby side of the game. Now, we sort of broke things down into, there's modeling and obviously a lot of painting, but people make terrain, they do a lot of converting. People even also get into their own narrative lores and create reasons and stories behind their armies as well.
Brian, I'll turn around on you, because you are one of the 3K players that I admire their hobby aspect the most. What kind of drives you in that space?
For me, the hobby side of it, as I got older, just became more of a relaxing experience for me. I was sort of at this meditative state where I could just, be with my army, kind of enjoy what I was doing.
Yeah, I totally relate with the idea of it being like a meditative state. And I think it's no coincidence that, the tournaments that I've seen you played in, Brian, like you win the Best Painted Award, and you also win the end of the game first place award too, because there's a meditative quality to painting into the hobby aspect. You think about different things as you're painting your models. For me, I really reflect upon, what is this model's place going to be in my list? Like, what are the different like names of the orc knob or whatever they are, and it gets you more in the mindset of the army. That way, once you play it, it really feels like a piece of you. Again, I think there's no coincidence that some of the top players we see, they kind of change up their lists all the time, but they're more or less, they stick to a certain faction. Sean Naden is very well known for his Eldar, and for good reason, because I think he has that same kind of mentality with it. And you look at his stuff, and it's beautiful painted models, and a lot of that is his own work. So take pride in what you do.
And I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here, because I'm slowly becoming on sort of the other end of the spectrum to you guys, where there's only so much time and bandwidth that we have, and time is our most valuable commodity that we have as individuals. And I just don't have time to hobby anymore. It's an area that I used to love. Now I find it as just a necessary evil, right, to be able to play a game of 40K. What I want to encourage people out there is that even if hobbying isn't your favorite aspect of 40K, it is a critical piece of being a complete player. You have to understand, how do I build an army? How do I model? How do I into the lore? And hopefully you find some engagement, you find some love in it. At the end of the day, if it's not something that you love about 40K, I would say don't feel bad about that either. There's ways that you can meet the requirements of getting colors on your models and still enjoy playing 40K without having first place painting awards, just like Brian over there.
And I think that's an important thing to stress too, because we painted a very general picture of these 5 categories, and we did not go into every little detail in depth. We will in the futures, but I think it's important to remember that's sort of this image that we're creating is the complete 40K player, and no one person is everything.
None of us are. None of us 3 gentlemen are. Check all those boxes. I think it's things that we aspire to, and I think that's kind of the message that we're trying to push out here too.
Yeah, and I think it's perfectly viable to pick and choose what you want from those boxes. Maybe hobby's not very important to you. So spend your time on other
raising
things.
my hand.
But, if you prefer the narrative, the fluff, you just love going to the store and having that good game and having a great, experience with another player, choose your own destiny. You can win this game in so many, many different ways.
And that's kind of what we're here to do, is just to encourage and support each other to grow as players and individuals.
And the real rub of it is all these categories actually interact, and they supplement one of another, and they elevate sort of one of another. Because what I want to kind of do now is let's go into each of these categories, but let's see how they relate and how we can actually draw from multiple categories to improve ourselves as players. So I want to touch back on something you mentioned, Brian, about the chess analogy and how you are looking at the game as a series of moves in different pieces for sort of different types of armies.
The most vital skills in a 40K player is your ability to evaluate a unit's capabilities, yours and your opponent's, and what role they play on the battlefield. Things that I like to think about, even on a more simplistic basis, is there's certain skills that help you progress from a beginner chess player to a more advanced chess player. And I like to think of some of those macro things, right? Like step number 1, develop your pieces quickly. How do you get them into position to hit those threat vectors and then focus on your win conditions? And one of the key strategies in chess is controlling the center of the board to create those threats. And that's very similar to 40K, right? Board control. You need to create firing lanes. You need to prepare to stage combats, counter assaults, and understanding your position on the board and how that plays with all of the pieces that you have.
Right, and a lot of the unit rules play into that, because
exactly right.
What units do I have that can establish that fire control? What ranges do I have? What weapon profiles do I have? So in this case, knowing your rules very well can inform your decision making on the battlefield itself.
Exactly right. In one of the biggest mistakes that beginner chess players make is moving their queen out too soon. Right? Because they want to create as many threat vectors as possible. But at the end of the day, a beginner chess player ends up overextending and exposing that queen, ends up losing it far too soon in the early game, maybe in the mid game of a chess match, where that queen, towards the middle and end game, becomes so powerful. This is actually what I love about your Patience and Presence article, Brian, is that understanding your queen on the battlefield, whether it's your Wolfen Squad, Shining Spears, Assault Centurions, Paladins, you name it, how can you leverage their presence in order to protect against threat vectors and not necessarily actually lose your queen too early? Is just one of the biggest mistakes that I see 40K players make.
Yeah, because I think being able to predict the outcome of a combat, so to speak, or an attack, so to speak, is a big part of it. And really, it's a combination of in-game, you might look at the board and be able to look at the resources available. And that's just one concept you have to have as a 40K player. And you can also, in a separate bubble, right, look at a unit's ability, it's all of its rules. And it sort of as these two independent things. The advanced decision making comes when you form a connection between those two and you see that, oh, look, there are fewer pieces on the board, so my queen is now suddenly much more powerful than I had initially evaluated it. So in the game, when the resources are dwindling, suddenly you have these powerful pieces in 40k really come to the forefront. So I've seen you do this with your solitaires and your characters, which when they start hitting the late game and there are fewer pieces on the board, they can just start to dominate the game because the game state is affecting the unit's rules and vice versa.
Exactly.
But even just knowing your rules very well and looking at the board state and being evaluating that really well is not enough. As Dustin, you pointed out, it's also a lot about the player. How do you use player psychology to sort of evaluate your turn-by-turn and long-term strategy?
It's tough from the psychology. There's two aspects of it, right? One is having the mental endurance to you have your game plan and to stick with it. One of the biggest things for me as an orc player to overcome when I was first getting into 8th edition was, hey, it would be awesome if I just did jump these boys right now on turn 1 and send them in, right?
It would be awesome.
It would be awesome. You know, sometimes it is awesome, and sometimes I do that. But that's one of the biggest things that I changed in my game plan was don't just knee-jerk stuff and send in your queen there on, like, you see that big, tasty morsel that you want to bite into. And it takes a lot to tell yourself, pump the brakes, wait a little bit, stick with your game plan, let it play out. At the same time, you know that your opponent is doing the same thing. You know, if you're really savvy, the other player is putting out these tasty morsels to kind of bait you to come out there, and you'd be doing the same thing as well. And understanding, again, from their body language, from the way that they're acting, from the way that they're moving stuff, even, you know, if maybe they're pulling out that tape measure to measure a couple of things, the psychology behind when to play that queen, when to hold that queen. Again, that the article was amazing. The patience and presence. It's read it. It is required reading if you want to make it happen in 40k.
Yeah, the immortal words of Dr. Ian Malcolm. So preoccupied in whether you could that you didn't stop to think if they should.
That is actually, that's a fantastic quote for it, because it's 100% right. There's so many players that the mistake they made is they didn't ask themselves whether they should. Maybe you did roll the cast that you needed to get warp time and send that demon prince barreling up there to chop off the head of some stinking Autarch who's just standing out there taunting you. But do you? Are you worried about the guardians are going to pop out and just dunk on you after you do? But it takes a lot to get there. It really does. And you can't just say, be like this. It takes a lot of practice, a lot of patience to get to that point where you're willing and able to do that.
Well, even back to the Northern Front Tabletop Simulator tournament that I was in, my game 3 with Neath of the Normal Blokes, we both sort of highlighted the fact that that baiting was a defining feature of that game, where turn 1 he tried to bait out my Wolfen by putting his Death Company sort of mid-board. Luckily, I was more reserved. I held back. Then turn 2, I started to set it up so I would bait out his Death Company and some of his veteran squads to come out. And he did pull them out, and ultimately we agreed kind of at the end of the game that we think he overextended there, which really ended up giving me the victory.
That's a great point, Brian. And like a key element of chess, right, is knowing when you have a bad piece, trading it quickly to try to enhance your position. This is a concept of that in 40k, where you're assessing your army, you're assessing your opponent's army, and you understand that this unit is probably not going to contribute much to my win condition. Maybe I can leverage this to bait something out, right? That's something that a lot of players are able to do more effectively. Some players are screening with units that you wouldn't think about screening, but they've understood that this piece actually is not a critical element to winning this matchup, as opposed to maybe in that example that you gave, Dustin, the Guardian squad is infinitely more important. It's just interesting the way that you think about it, right? The game theory of 40k.
Yeah, I think another very important point Dustin brought up too is the fact that he just knows himself very well, because all of us have our biases and what do we really like to do. It's like, I just love rushing into combat. I love chopping stuff down and whack-a-mole and people into the ground with thunderhammers. So I have to be aware of that. I know it was very conscious. I wanted to run those Wolfen out turn 1, but I knew I was like, I'm biased. I know I want to run them out, so I got to be very cautious when I make those decisions and put a little more effort in analyzing those situations than I would some other ones, just because I know I'm bound to make the wrong decision in a lot of cases. So I put more focus on those.
Bet that took a lot of discipline and willpower, but I bet that paid off for you.
It did. And it was not something I've always done, right? It's something I've definitely had to learn to do. Again, because something like, how do I decide what to do during this turn? It's not just a simple answer of a simple concept. There's so many of these different things that play into it. So another very common question is, how do I write a list? You know, people always put up these list ideas. Writing a list, hey, critique this list. How do I get good at list writing? Well, the answer is really looking at yourself as a complete 40K player and trying to draw in as many different concepts and pull from many different sources. So what are some of the things you guys have to consider when you're going to write a list?
List building is one of my favorite aspects of 40K. The thing that I do first when I'm thinking about a list is knowing myself, how do I like to play the game? What kind of tools do I have that can help me execute on a division? So,
right, and that's a combination of action choice and rules, as well as your psychology.
Exactly right.
Again,
that's exactly right. It also goes to community aspect, understanding, hey, you know, there's people who are more knowledgeable than me. How can I build an army that will execute on this vision of mine? So from my perspective, I've always loved to have a very toolkitty type of player. I enjoy having armies that are very well rounded, that allow me tool or options to deal with any type of army archetype or any situation. Knowing that about myself, that's kind of what I go. Do I have durable units? Do I have combat abilities? Do I have the ability to shoot? You know, do I have psychic abilities? Can I interact in every phase of the game? All of those questions go into sort of list building, and it's not so binary as this is a good unit or this is a bad unit, as opposed to what are the capabilities? What can this unit do on the battlefield, and what roles can they fill?
Now, a big one I've always see people miss. My first question whenever reviewing a list is always, what missions are these for? Is this for a specific tournament packet? Is it for Eternal War? Is it for Maelstrom? Is it for narrative? Because even pulling in from just how the core rules are played and how the missions are played impacts that greatly.
Yeah, very much so. There's so many pieces that go into the construction of a list. You could probably make a list, or you could probably have 20, 30 different pieces that should influence you in how you're making this list. And I think a lot of new players, inexperienced players, make the sole assumption that the only thing that matters is the math hammer, right? How many wounds am I going to apply to a knight equivalent or a marine equivalent? And those are important to know when you're building that list in terms of determining the overall effectiveness of something on paper. But there is so much more to the game in the list than just that.
Oh, like, do I like these models? Let's go into the hobby side.
Right.
Do I enjoy this army? Some people have an awesome Wraith host type of army that I love playing. Is it the most competitive? Maybe not, but it can be made competitive. Love seeing it on the tabletop. And so you cannot overstate the importance of being connected and having that feeling of fulfillment of, I really enjoy playing this. I enjoy the aesthetic. I love everything about it. I think that hobby part plays a big key in determining lists as well.
Yeah, to give you one that I had to consider myself last year was, do I physically feel like pushing around 200 to 300 models? The answer was no. The answer was no. From a time perspective, which you need to consider when making a list. From my personal satisfaction, from the when you're playing with your partner, are they going to have a fun time versus this list? Those are all things you have to consider for list making, and I'm very serious with that. It's so there's so many different pieces, and I think if you look to build yourself more as this complete player, you'll be so much better positioned to create a list that is also a reflection of that complete player.
Yeah, and I think it is a difficult topic, and it is really hard for new players because you don't have so much of your own map as a 40K player established yet. So I think when you're not sure on some of these more complex topics, it's because maybe there's a gap in one of these areas that you're sort of missing.
That's where I love having this community with you guys, with Justin, with Brian, with Nick, with Max, with Ryan, and everyone else in GDFC, is guys all help me become a better player and just a better individual in general. And I would highly recommend, if you aren't connected, the community of players that are invested in you as a player, but also as just a human being, you ought to find that, because that's one of the biggest and best aspects of 4K, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think so, because you're never going to be a complete player, and you're going to have a lot of gaps at the start. And I think a lot of our discussions is how we sort of fill out each other's maps. I know when we started this, I had you all draw your own individual maps, and then we reviewed each other's maps. We found a lot of gaps and a lot of things missing added in. Justin had a lot more focus and very interesting aspects for the psychology aspect. Brian went very in-depth in sort of the in-game decision making, where I was going really heavy sort of into the rules. So these are really good topics. If you have a really good friend, if you have another regular opponent or someone you love to discuss the game with, just go up to them and talk to them and be like, what do you think are the key aspects of pregame knowledge? What do you think the key aspects of in-game decision making? What do you think is important about player health? Or what do you love about the hobby? Or how do you have a good game with an opponent? What are the sportsmanship aspects required? And then in those discussions, new little bubbles, new little ideas start popping up for you, and you'll start drawing more and more connections. As you draw more connections, you'll start formulating more complex ideas.
You'll see more ways to play the game if you play different people too. Absolutely. I think if you two just played each other nonstop and never anyone else, you would only know each other's approach to the game. Looking at the different maps that all the members of GDFC did, I saw so many areas of the game that I wasn't doing that you were, and I thought to myself, well, here's a piece of the approach that I need to bring into mine. That's one thing I love about playing at my local game store is there's 20, 30, 40 different people, and they all play the game a different way. And it's an awesome way to grow as a person. So branch out and play tournaments, because again, you're going to see people that are completely different in their approach, and you'll learn a ton from seeing how they come to the game.
Not only does this benefit you on the tabletop and in 40K, but life in general, right? Is oftentimes it's too easy for us to associate with people that are like us. We want confirmation bias. We want to hear the things that we want to hear. One of the reasons I love with Brian, right? You have such a different perspective on 40K than I do. Go Reavers. Yeah. Again, diversity and being well-rounded. And I would encourage people to seek out who think differently from themselves, being open to those ideas, because that's going to help you become better, like you said, Dustin, a better individual, well, not just a better 40K player. That can be difficult. Our online communities often don't like that or encourage it. Be open to those thoughts.
I want to thank everyone for joining our episode today. We really only scratched the surface on all of these subjects. It's something we definitely want to dive to more in the future. Hopefully we've set a good foundation today so we can continue to build upon it. I would like to challenge all of you guys to try and make your own concept maps. Think about what are the critical elements of a good 40K player. How do they sort of relate with one another? And once you have this idea in your head, I want you guys to go to grimdarkfilthycasuals.com and compare them to ours. See what's missing. Was there anything we had missed? If you want to get into the conversation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and you can comment in any of our social media channels, and feel free to inquire about joining our Discord. We're always happy to hear from all of you guys, and we love the discussions that we've had so far. We'll see you all out there on the battlefield.